So welcome back to Kokoro Conversations. I'm Alex Lang.
I'm Rebekah Anderson.
And we get together every so often to talk about topics that we think are interesting, have conversations around them, topics that are universal to the human experience. And today we're going to be talking about the idea of triggers. So everybody is triggered by different things. And so we're going to talk about those things that trigger us, why they trigger us, and what we can do about it. So I took some time, because I know you pretty well, to think of some triggers that might get you at a deep level. And so I printed some pictures, and I wanted to see what your reaction to was with each of these. So this is the first trigger that I came up with right here. So this is an older woman pointing to a younger woman. Now, do you have a sense of why I would do that?
Yes.
So, what is it about this particular shaming that's going on here that triggers you? Because I think this is an interesting thing. Having known you for a while, I know that this is a trigger of yours.
Well, I like the word shaming. Just, I think there's a certain power for me that comes with like an older woman, an authority figure, saying that I not just like have done something bad behaviorally, but that there is something bad about me fundamentally that, you know, I think that would bother anybody, but there's something too about it coming from a person in that kind of specific place in their life that would be tough.
So, because I think that what you've dealt with is, and I think all young people to some degree deal with this when they're getting into their careers, right? Is when somebody who's older than you just assumes, based on your age, that you know very little about what you're doing and that you have a lot that you need to learn, which, to be fair, is true of people who are younger. Like, that is something that we tend to need to do when we're young, is we have to learn and we need experiences. But why does that particular thing, because I think it's an interesting question, right? Like, so for me, I'm more triggered by women.
Really?
Yeah. Because my mom was very critical of me. And so I can be, so like when a man talks down to me, when a man tries to say, you don't know what you're doing, it rolls off me a lot more easily than a woman who would then be in the place of my mother, who's older, who will, because that triggers something deep in me of kind of like when I was young growing up. So it's like when somebody insults me and it's a man, I can just kind of be like, all right, well, you don't know what you're talking about. When a woman does it, it hits on a deeper level. I can say that to myself, you don't know what you're talking about, but it stays with me a lot longer.
Yeah, it's interesting because for me, I don't know that I think there has to be a gender component to it to a certain extent, but I think the distinction is that it's triggering to me in a totally different way depending on gender, because I do find that with women, like often there is such a relational element. And so if there's conflict with gender, it typically is like the frustrating aspect can be like, you're not relating to me right now, or it's usually that there's a lack of trust. Like a trust issue feels a bit bigger with a woman than with a man for me. And then with men, sometimes there's experiences where I'm like, you're just fundamentally lacking understanding of like my specific experience in this situation. But with women, I find that what's tougher, like you, like I come from experiences with having difficult issues with women in my upbringing, unfortunately. And so I think that what can happen there is it can feel a little bit more like there's an emotional piece.
Yeah, well, I wonder with like your dancing in particular, you know, because like what you dealt with in dancing was you're in there and you literally, the entire point is for these teachers to be critical of your form and what you're doing and how you're doing it. And so you're constantly being critiqued.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that, I mean, and you did that from the time you were what, like 4? Like you were little when you started, right?
Yeah.
So like I would assume that might be something that deep in your psyche as you're developing that could have like a component to it.
Yeah, I think too that like there is this part of like that, like the relational piece where it's like you have all this information that you can use against me, which is hard. So I can remember when I was like 15, I had a teacher that was like, she was going through a lot at that point, which I know now. But I remember her dog had just died, actually. Like, she just put her dog down and she had this young daughter. I know it was tough on them. And I had this rehearsal where she just like really kept poking at me, like in this way where I was like, Jesus, like, what is happening? This is tough. And at a certain point, like, I was going through my own stuff. I'm 15 years old, let alone a million other things going on at that point. And I just remember I like broke down because I was like, this is just too much. Like, it's been a long week. I can't do it anymore. Please. Just like, it was almost like a crying because my body was like, I just can't take this anymore. Yeah. And so it was sort of like my body's way, I think, of like letting her know, like, you really do have to stop at this point. Like, I've reached my threshold. And I remember her saying in the rehearsal, like, I understood this when you were 4, but now, like, this is just too much. And I was like,
wow, that's really hard. That's digging like real, like that's a really deep cut right there.
It was a deep sort of cut, like your emotions are too much.
Because she knew for somebody, and I think that's like an interesting thing, right? If somebody knows you and then they can use that against you, that's a huge thing. I wonder too though, like, cause to jump back to, cause I think this is an interesting thing you talk about, and women are more relational than men. Men do tend, it takes a long time for men to really, generally, I mean, this is not for all men, but I think relationally, men can be not as adept as women, right? And I wonder though, for you, like, cause if it's a man who's critiquing you, like on some level, I feel like there's a sexism that's just kind of automated to that. But when a woman does it, I wonder if part of it is like, well, women in the workforce, it's been so hard to gain a foothold, to get the equality, right, that you need to get. And so for a woman to not come alongside you and say, hey, we're in this together. I know how hard it's going to be because we're in a man's world and we're really trying to change all of that. Yeah. For a woman not to do that, I feel like that's the relational component that can be really insulting in a sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there is this sense, to me also, I do put a lot of weight in women's opinions of me, of the world, like, and that's totally not necessarily conscious. I think I also, like, I respect your opinion a lot. I, like, if you tell me something, if you offer me feedback, it really does give me pause. It makes me really think. And there are a lot of women who I don't necessarily like, I feel like you've earned that with me.
But we've taken the time to form a relationship, right? So it's like over years, now I've earned that trust, right? Which is true, I think, of anybody. Like if you've earned the trust over time, you now have earned the right to offer a critique that should earn, it's worthy of more reflection than somebody who barely knows you. Yeah. And so I do think that there's a component to that. That's a triggering element to me. It's like, you don't even know who I am, and you think you're...
Exactly. Well, and I have to imagine, like, I wonder with you, is it too that, like, for you, there's maybe an assumption of, like, you're trying to just do your job. So inherent to, like, doing a person's job, inherent to having a position of power in your work or in your family, it means you have to make hard decisions. It means that you have to sometimes like do things that upset people and ruffle feathers. And I wonder, like, do you sometimes have the experience of somebody putting on top of that, like, some sort of sexism that's certainly not your intent, but like it's inherent criticism to like making just a hard choice?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's interesting. So, I've had to make, in my career, when I was particularly like at the top of an organization, like a leader, when I was like a head pastor of a church, I was making decisions, alongside obviously our boards and whatnot, but, you're making decisions about employment, you're making decisions about the direction of the church. And, I do think that I remember one person called me a cowboy, saying like, oh, you're just a cowboy, just going off, doing your own thing, shooting from the hip. You don't really care what anybody else thinks, right? That was the intention. And there was a kind of part of me that I was like, like it was this, when you talk about sexism, it's like men don't listen, men do what they want, you're just doing what you want, and that's wrong. Like you really need to be listening. When I was like, I feel like I listen to people all the time, and in fact I'm really trying to take into account other people's opinions on things. However, that said, I'm not going to dictate all my behavior around what other people like think, because that's debilitating.
Right.
You can't, like, if you're going to live according to other people's version of what you should be, you're going to fail ultimately. Because particularly if you're talking about 1,000 people, which is what I was dealing with, right? You're never going to, so you just have to choose a path and go down it and know some people are going to be angry.
My best experiences in some ways with like working in a place or with leadership has been working with women, but it was always women that were able to really uplift me and uplift other people and speak calmly and centeredly to certain situations. And then to the other end, it's like some of the experiences that I've had with women who were leaders that were really hard, where when it was like your feelings were seen as bad, or whenever you had something to speak up about, it was just pushed off to the side. Like that hurts a lot more for me when it comes from a colleague that's a woman or from a friend that's a woman.
Yeah, so, and I think that's true for me too. Like, for me, a woman can be my biggest trigger just because of the stuff that I dealt with my mom. But at the same time, I will say the best colleagues I've had by far were women. And I think that, so it's like you get, I think within those triggers, what you find at least is whatever your trigger is, oftentimes whoever that person is, regardless of the gender, it really tends to represent, it can be the very best and the worst of things. And I think that that's what's hard about it, is that whoever your trigger is, however that developed when you were young, and usually those triggers come from something deep inside you from when you were young. So, and it depends on who it was who did it, and how that manifests can be in very different ways, right?
Yeah.
What's healing is when you come across somebody who actually takes whatever that trigger is, and then, like you talked about, does the very thing that you're expecting, like, oh, this person's going to judge me or hurt me or whatever. And they don't. And in fact, they end up being this kind of amazing version of what you kind of always wanted. And you're like, oh, that's fantastic to have that. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you on that. Okay, you ready for another one? I'm going to try another one.
Whew.
All right,
I'm ready.
All right.
It's like exposure therapy,
Yeah,
Alex.
Okay, here we go. So this one.
Oh yeah.
Right here, the Legos.
Oh, no.
Okay, so we're not going to get into the whole story behind it, but
My favorite story.
it's your favorite story. But I do, but I do think it's an interesting question of, for me, the reason why I chose this is not because of the story, which had to do with when we were filming. So we were filming Kokoro originally. It had to do with that. What it has to do with is, I think, a deeper question of competence, right?
Yeah.
For you. So it's a little bit. So So the first one was talking about somebody talking down to you. I think this one is more about, and I have the same trigger, by the way. But for you, it happened in this context, right? So the context here was, if I guess we put it out, like we were putting together equipment, which takes time to build. And sometimes it wasn't coming together quickly enough. Let's put it that way, the way that we needed it to. Yeah. So I think that inherently brings a question of, I step in and I was like, oh, I'll do it. So I think in that moment, because of that, you feel not as competent as you normally would. So the question then becomes, why is it that, like, where does the trigger of competence come in for you? Because I know that that's a deep trigger in some ways.
I think what's interesting in the context of how that happened was, like, whenever I find myself faced with that trigger of competence, I have tended to have a route, which is to, like, if I think I can't do something, I just, like, kind of have historically thrown up my hands and been like, yep, I just can't. Like, I'm just bad at it. I did it with math as a kid. Like, I just decided I couldn't, and so I didn't. Like, I did really, really poorly in math and in school in general, actually. Like in college, I did super well in such a way where when I told my professors I was like a really bad student in high school, they were like, we don't believe you at all. And I was like, oh no, pull up the transcripts. They were pretty rough. And it was just sort of like
it was a trigger to the point where you were like, well, I'm just not going to do it anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was like, I would say that was my way of managing, but it's like a total, like, it's a decision to not manage, right? Like, I threw up my hands in the air and just decided, like, I'm not going to see it as important. And in a way, like, I had some valid excuses, like, sitting there and saying, like, well, when am I going to use math ever? Why is it important? Or this hasn't been taught to me in a way that makes sense. And there's some validity to it, but the fact that I would just give up rather than embracing the struggle that ultimately produces something good on the other side, like I just see that as such a miss. But then to the other side, I think incompetence, like in some ways, what's frustrating to me less than competence is not feeling that I have the tools that I need to actually do something well.
Right.
And it's not just that they don't necessarily come from inside. It's there's something really frustrating about needing to do something and not feeling that I have the capacity to even articulate what it is that I need. Like that is very hard for me, and I think it's hard for me because there's a real lack of control to it. Like I see clearly that I have a need. I just don't even know how to say what I need. I don't even know what to do. And
that's an interesting thing, because it's like, now that as a trigger, that clearly goes back to stuff to when you were very young, right?
Yeah.
Like where you're in an environment where you are out of control, you have no control over it, right? And you lack the vocabulary to even articulate what you need. So the easiest way to deal with, a lot of children are this way, right? The easiest way to deal with environments is you either fight back, right? You get angry, or you become invisible and you just try to slide through and make your way through, right? Because that is in a sense where the throwing the hands up kind of thing can come from, because later on down the road, right, if that's what you're used to, it's like, I just need to be invisible. The easiest way is to just, slowly remove yourself from the situation.
Yeah. And it's really hard because, like, I don't even know that I've ever articulated that it's not, like, for me, it's the not even having the ability to say, I don't know what to even do here. Like, to go back to that example of like being triggered as a ballet dancer when I was 15, like I remember specifically what it was my teacher was asking. She wanted me to like go further across the floor than I was doing. And she'd asked me a couple times and I just like did not, like what she was saying, I just like didn't quite, like
you weren't comprehending what she was asking you to do.
Yeah, like it was almost like she was speaking one language and I was hearing another altogether. And it was not intentional at all. Like I wasn't trying to like stick my fingers in my ears and say la 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 la. But in that moment, like the intensity of the emotion just made it so I'm like, you're saying something in a language I don't understand. So if you're just going to increase the volume,
right.
like
you need to change the words, because otherwise, like clearly I'm not grasping what you're getting.
And you're getting so upset that I'm just kind of like, I'm losing my ability to even say anything. And I knew in that environment, it's like, if I say anything to you, you're going to say I'm talking back when I just don't understand. In a situation like that, like, just not having the ability to even ask what you need feels like the worst, like lack of control imaginable. And
and I get that, because I think for me, the competence issue.
Well, that's what I was going to ask is like, what does lack of competence or like the trigger around that look like for you? Because I know what it looks like for me, and I think it looks different for you.
Oh, absolutely. For me, it's when somebody questions my authority on something. So there are some things where I recognize openly, I don't know anything about this. I'm the kind of person who I'm like, if I recognize you as an expert in something, I'm going to ask you about it and you tell me. I'm not going to sit here and try to explain things to you that I don't understand. However, when we get to my areas that I know well, the moment that somebody tells me, like, or even kind of intimates, you don't know what you're doing, that's the moment that I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to prove you wrong. And I'm going to prove that I do know what I'm doing. And so that's kind of like, my mentality is less throw up my hands and more dig in and to keep just going and proving to you that you don't know what you're talking about. Now, that's both ways of doing that are not very healthy because the truth is that like if somebody sits there and says to me, probably a big trigger for me would be like particularly in the area of religion and the way that I approach it. So, I've spent decades studying and thinking about this, and in ways that frankly, a lot of people have not. And so for me, when I offer my opinion on something, right? You don't have to. I always say, like, it's just my opinion. You take it for what it's worth. Yeah. And a lot of times, what I discovered when I did this the right way, when I was feeling triggered, was I would sit down and say, well, where is it coming from that you are challenging my authority on this? And oftentimes, it's because they feel that something I said has put them in a place where they can no longer authentically feel like they can believe what they should believe. And we're talking about religion, where everything is really, if we're being honest, constructed. So to them, though, they've turned that constructed reality into fact, and as opposed to something that they believe. So when I come back maybe with history saying, hey, this thing that we've believed for a long time may not be as accurate as we think. That to them is really like, I totally understand why somebody would react that way. And their way of coming at me is to undermine my authority, because if my authority is undermined, then the thing that I said, it becomes less true or entirely false. So I think that the big thing, though, is that in those situations now that I'm older, rather than sit there and try to prove you wrong with my strength or my will or my intellect or whatever it is, that I'm coming back and I'm sitting down and I'm saying, hey, I'm sorry I made you feel that way. Because probably it's something I said, or it's something that's happening in their life that I don't fully comprehend, that they're bringing to the situation, that if I were to understand better, we could get to the root cause, which maybe isn't even really about me. It's about something that they're going through. Yeah. But it's that level of understanding that gets away from, I feel triggered, right? And therefore I'm going to come at you. And that's a very, very different response than I feel triggered and I sit there and I consciously realize, ooh, this is triggering me. Okay, I got to step back for a second. Why is this triggering me? Okay, this person said something that did X, Y, Z. Okay, so rather than make it about me and how I'm hurt, let me sit down and try to be understanding and talk to them. Now, in my best moments, I do that. In my worst moments, when I'm not fully aware and present, I fall back into the old patterns, which is very easy to do, right? Yeah. I think that if you're not in the right place. So, I think that for many of us, whatever your trigger is, that is kind of, in many ways, a way forward, which we're going to talk about. I want to talk about kind of how we get to that point of being able to be aware of it. But I want to do one more trigger before we move into that. And this is the last one. Okay. All right. Now this one, I was going to put something here, but I wanted you to see what you think what this is. And I was going to put a word on it, but I was like, I don't know if so if the first one was shame, right? And the second one is competence. What does this come at to you? And this is a man pointing his finger at a woman who's got her hands over her eyes.
Looks like blame.
Absolutely, blame. Yeah. So I would say I think blame is something that is a trigger for you.
Oh yeah.
So
it really is.
So that's obviously all these have been personal, but I think this one's very personal in some ways. So I'm interested to know kind of like for you, like how blame why that's like a deep trigger for you and like how that manifests.
Gosh, like there are a couple of parts of why blame hurts a lot for me. And one of them actually like makes me think of something you were describing around competence, which is like that phrase, you are wrong. Mm-hmm. To me, it's not surprising to me that anyone would feel triggered by that phrase, because at its core is like, it's an invalidating phrase. And this is very much from my childhood. I grew up with a very inflamed sense of responsibility in that I was blamed for things all the time. The worst of which being like, I was blamed a lot for how the people around me felt, or I don't even want to call it blame. Blame is how it feels, but I was made responsible for the feelings of people around me a lot. Like, I did something and therefore someone else feels one way or another. And so part of why blame hurts me a lot is I care a lot about how other people feel. I care a lot about my role to play in a situation. If something goes wrong, I am often the first person to take responsibility for my role in the problem. Like, I'm the first to claim incompetence, even like, oh God, I really did screw that up. And I certainly don't try to.
By doing that, it's kind of like a psychological thing, right? You're reorienting yourself. You're like, well, my intention is to bring positivity and good into the world. And if I did that, well, my goodness, like, nobody's perfect. So clearly this is, I made the mistake. And so immediately, because that's so much a fundamental part of who you are, the initial reaction is, I'll just take that onto myself, because obviously, like, it's so important to kind of keep that part, as opposed to examining the situation, which is most people's first reaction when they get blamed, is to say, well, hold on a second. Like, is this entirely my fault? Like, they're asking that question. For you, that's not necessarily the first thing you ask, is it?
No, it's really not. And I was kind of conditioned to be that way because, if I'm conditioned to not even think about that, then I kind of absolve other people of their role in a situation. And, I've done a lot of work on this just because I take on such a ridiculous amount of responsibility in relationships, usually like with friends or, romantic relationships. And I read this one book that I really appreciated where like this relationship expert talked about encouraging people to like own their part in the problem. And in a relationship, like typically every person holds some responsibility. I mean, and it was this woman author who I just love, Harriet Lerner, and she's like, if my husband and I are in a fight, I'll be like, I own 5% of this problem and you're the 95%. And she's like, but I mean, the reality is that the other piece would be me blaming him 100%. And that's not true. Like, I do have a role to play in the problem. Yeah. I'm just wondering though, like for you, I kind of feel like the first one, like the shame piece, like somebody sitting there and speaking down to you. I feel like it's deeply connected to the blame for me. And I'm wondering, like, what is this a trigger for you, would you say? And what does it look like? How does it show up?
I will be honest with you, being blamed for something doesn't really trigger me that much. Because generally, if there is, I guess I'm conditioned to know that I always think, I am partially responsible for something. Like, whenever I'm in some system, that is partly me. Like, yes, I know that I bear some responsibility. And I'm like you in the sense that I'm willing to openly acknowledge that. But I never take full responsibility because I also know that there's other parts of the system at play. So I'm very open to say, like, no, absolutely. Like, I want to make sure that everybody's seeing this kind of with the right kind of lenses. So, as an example, I think something that happened which was interesting was, there was a moment in the church where there was a group of people who were saying, everybody here is really unhappy with what you're doing. And that particular moment, I'm well aware that the way that I preach my messages can be perceived as antagonistic because I'm questioning just about every fundamental assumption that you have. So from the perspective of somebody who has kind of owned a set of beliefs their entire lives, they've never questioned those beliefs. My approach is just by default going to cause you a great deal of consternation. So I own that. So, and so when they came to me and they said, everybody's really unhappy, I said, that could very well be true. Because if I don't know how everybody thinks, I don't know how everybody believes. So if the vast majority of people in here are really attached to their beliefs, in my mind, I'm like, well, that could be true. However, I also know that from the feedback I get, people tend to generally like what I do. So it's like, let's figure this out. So I said, well, let's do a survey. Let's figure out where people really stand, how they feel about this, where we are in general. And what it came back is that it was about 78% of the people there really liked what was happening. Like they felt really good about it. And there was about, 22% who were kind of on the sliding scale towards not enjoying it as much. So what that told me is, you're in a decent majority at that point. And, and particularly anything like that, not everybody's going to love you. So you kind of have to just be okay with the fact that everything there. So blame not necessarily is something that triggers me in that way. So the trigger, if I'm really kind of digging down into it, is I was not very comfortable with myself. I didn't like myself. And so I think by assumption, I assumed that other people didn't like me. And therefore, when somebody said something that was rude, and that would be a huge trigger for me. People being rude, like that really pisses me off. Like
sure.
to this day, like anytime somebody is rude and kind of, for no apparent reason, whatever, when you're out there, like if somebody's rude to me, it really sticks with me. Like it's really hard for me. And so that was one of the first things that my therapist dealt with was talking about, like, when people are that way, it's stuff that's going on in their own lives. It almost has nothing to do with you. And that was really hard for me to kind of understand, because to me, and this is maybe growing up in the South, being like, you were taught to be polite about so many things, right?
Correct.
But what was interesting was that politeness was like to your face, and then people would be rude, like, kind of behind closed doors. So there was this kind of hypocrisy to it, but it was really instilled in me, like, you need to be polite. Like in the world, when you're with people, being polite is extraordinarily important. That was drilled into my head. And then I go out into the world and I find out, actually, that's not how most people are taught these days. That might have been something that was taught in like the 50s and 60s. But and maybe to select people growing up, but a lot of people were not taught that. And they're just rude by default. Like that's just kind of how they are. And you can't take that personally. And I was just taking everything so personally. And she said, your mantra is, it's not about you. It's not about you.
Oh, wow. And it's interesting because it just makes me think to like the shame piece, because if you fundamentally see yourself as unworthy, anything that kind of reinforces that message is going to feel like a dagger in your sense of self. And then you sit there and you start to understand that, like, disappointing people or people being rude to you, it's just part of life. Like it says nothing about who you are, and a lot more often about who they are. But it is just fascinating how these triggers, they burrow deep in us, and they have a way of coming out at interesting moments in our lives.
So the question then becomes, like, how do you identify what those triggers are in your life? Because I think sometimes we're aware of them. Like sometimes we can be aware of them. Other times it's actually you're kind of unconscious to what the triggers are that are happening. And so I think that's an interesting question of, how do you become aware of those things that are kind of lurking beneath that can send you off in ways that you probably don't want to be set off, but are there. What do you think?
Usually if I am like stuck thinking about something for a while, it's a good sign that it has triggered me and that it has upset me. And usually if I start to like really fundamentally wonder about myself as a person, like deep down in the core of my being, what does this say about who I am as a person? Like the word that I've read somewhere is like, you're flooded by feelings, flooded by all sorts of like stuff in your brain and your body that's making it just impossible to think with any logic, any reason. And so for me, usually if I'm just like stuck in a thought pattern on loop, or if I'm feeling physically like agitated, which is not, that's like not my general state of being. I'm usually really pretty content and pleasant. That's a good sign to like slow down, just kind of breathe, get yourself back to a different sort of state.
But, I would say, would you say that you were that way prior to the therapy?
Oh, like conscious and aware?
No, like calm, like you're like the state that you said you are now. Were you that way prior to that? Because I certainly wasn't. I realized like one of the first exercises that she taught me to do was, she was like, I want you to go from your head to your toes, and I want you to feel everything in your body. And I was like, why? And she goes, because she's like, the point is that you need to check in, because she says, I know you think you're super in touch with your emotions, but you're not. And I was like, that makes me angry that you would say that. So
incompetent, Alex.
I know. So, but she was like, you need to do that. And she goes, usually our emotions have some kind of physical manifestation in our body.
Sure.
It can be a muscle, it can be like twitching, it can be like a tenseness, increased breathing, all these things, increased heart rate. So the whole point is that you have to check in. And she's like, just do it 3 times a day, where you just go top to bottom, say, how do I feel? And I started doing that. And what I realized, God, I am like angry all the time. Like I would have never said that had I not done this check-in. And so I started to realize, like, wow, I really am kind of in this angry, tense state constantly. And then once you see it, then you can start to back away from it. But if that's your kind of like what I realized is I was in this constant state of alertness that I didn't need to be in, but I was in that state because I was always ready for somebody to come after me. And I was just completely unaware that was kind of what was happening with me. But that's kind of how I grew up, and it's not shocking that would just continue on. And I think that's the thing you kind of, like, I think that was one of the most incredible things that this early therapist taught me. And I've learned different things from different therapists along the way. But that was kind of one of the most important things, was that you are going to, like, in order to really fully get a sense of who you are right now, you have to do an inventory of your kind of state of being. And that takes a lot of time. In fact, I would say that I really didn't fully, I did that every day for like 6 months. Yeah. And by the end of that 6 months, I was like, oh, I think I'm getting it now. Like, I think I see a little more clearly who I am. And so I'm wondering, you probably weren't given the same exercises, but I'm interested to know kind of how you got from where you were at your heightened state to kind of what you're talking about now, which is now you can say, I'm generally a very calm person, and I can tell now when I'm upset because I'm not that way.
Yeah, it's so good to break it down that way, because the truth is, like, yeah, I was really dysregulated and for the most part, like, where I found myself was like, I was just avoiding a lot of triggering. So I would find my little places where I sort of felt a lot better. So I didn't necessarily deal with what I was going through by feeling like my natural state wasn't so much to get super angry, although occasionally like that would happen with a triggering situation. I think I was much more like anxious, and the way that has manifested, I've always had issues with biting my nails. And it's not even in like high intensity situations. Like if I'm stuck in bad traffic and I'm running late, I just naturally like, oh, my fingers are in my mouth. I didn't even notice that. Or if I'm like writing a paper, oftentimes I find myself like chewing my nails without realizing it. So I have these physical manifestations of anxiety, to be sure, but for the most part, like I just start to numb out a lot. That's really where I find myself. So I was like that growing up at home, and I think like the other biggest time where I found I was able to notice it because I had done a lot of work in therapy, but it was like, you know, I was in a situation where I found myself in an environment that was so much like my home that I was like, oh gosh, this is like a really familiar feeling and I don't like it. So what I started to do was I started to wake up, started to like meditate and do certain like affirmations of myself to help reclaim that like platform of self-worth.
So I think for anyone who's living in an environment where they're dealing with a heightened sense of awareness, it can be very hard to really figure out what your norm should be, because you're always having to function that way. I know that for me, and I know this is true for you, I had to extricate myself from those environments so that I could then get kind of a handle on, oh, okay, like when I'm in that environment, I'm reacting a certain way. And if you don't have that luxury, it's much more difficult to find your state of normal when you can't just walk away from those things and kind of figure out where your stasis is outside of that. So I do think it's really important for people to understand that if you're kind of stuck in your situation, whatever that situation might be, and you can't move out of that environment, it takes more time. It's not that it's impossible, it just takes more time because you're always kind of swimming in the ocean as opposed to being outside of it to really be able to appreciate kind of where you are as a person. So I think that's an element of triggers that just needs to kind of be pointed out. But the last question that I think we need to talk about, which is an interesting one, is, are triggers always a bad thing in and of themselves? So, because I think we've established that when you react to a trigger, more often than not, you're reacting poorly, right? And I'm not saying you personally. I'm just saying like we as people, we tend to react poorly.
Are you blaming me?
I am.
You're blaming
You react poorly to these situations. If only you would just do a little bit better. Maybe I should call somebody who really knows what they're doing. And then we'll be in good shape, okay?
You try and find somebody like that, Alex.
Okay, gotta bring it down. Sorry.
No, that was good.
I did one on the other. So
You really, like,
I realized,
took me through.
yeah.
No, that was really good.
So go ahead. What were you gonna say about so I just wonder what's your response to, are triggers, where do you see triggers being in your life? Like good, bad, or indifferent? What do you think?
It's interesting. I said earlier, and it's something that I've had to learn over time, which is thoughts are neither good nor bad. They just are. It's what our brains do. They come up with all sorts of thoughts. We think all the time. And really, a trigger is just a physical, emotional response to a thought or an experience that we're having. It's not a good or bad thing. I just think that it's the behavioral response that can really mislead us. The truth is, being triggered can lead us to do things or say things that we don't mean, that aren't a reflection of what we believe or what we value. And so the reality is being able to respond better to what's triggering to us, I think only does good things for us. So to me, if I'm triggered by something that it's usually a sign that something is not right, that there's injustice.
Yes. I think that's a big part of it too, is I think triggers, I think in and of themselves, they tell you something's wrong. Something's not quite the way that it should be.
Yeah.
And so it does tell, it's kind of an internal barometer of kind of what's happening in an environment, which isn't necessarily always a bad thing. So if you're triggered, like you said, that tells you, and I do think that often it does come from a sense of injustice. I do think that there's a sense of that that's going on.
Yeah. Whenever we find ourselves in situations that are triggering, often what we have to confront is that we can only control our response to a situation. I can't control the way you're going to respond. I can only choose to respond in the way that I want to. And so what I've had to realize is I have to actually sit there and say in response to a trigger, what does it look like for me to restore a sense of justice here? And sometimes what that means is just I have to change the way I respond here. I have to talk to this person about how their behavior is making me feel. Sometimes it means I have to leave the situation behind altogether. But I've had to really come to realize that creating justice for myself doesn't actually have to require other people sometimes. Sometimes I can seriously create a sense of restored justice within myself. But walking away, avoiding, Pretending like something's not a problem is not an option. And so, but if I was to sit there and say like, well, triggers are bad and it's all my fault.
If you can be calm about something, you have a lot more leverage to fix the situation rather than losing it completely, which is kind of, for most of my life, that was how I understood you deal with conflict. If you lose it, you will, you have a chance of winning because the angrier person often comes out on top, right?
Right.
And the other person will eventually yield. And that is the worst way to deal with conflict because you're never really getting to any sense of understanding. So I do think, to get back to the question, which is this idea of, are triggers ever a good thing? I think they are. I think that ultimately, triggers, they are that kind of internal sense of right and wrong. And I think we need those. If you're totally disconnected from that, that's not good.
Yeah.
Because then things are happening, and you're not ever going to really respond to them in the way that you should. So there's that middle ground. There's being too involved, which most of us are, and then there's being too disconnected.
Oh yeah.
And so you kind of have to find that kind of middle tension to make it work.
Yeah, and it is so interesting because, just raising those issues of prejudice. I mean, the reality is, there is some awful stuff in the world that people choose to ignore or that people choose to not get upset over that we absolutely should be furious about. It is wrong that people are hungry in this country. It's wrong that people are without homes. It's wrong that there's war and racism and prejudice and hurt. Yeah. And when we ignore that, I think actually our sense of self really does start to deteriorate. I think the challenging reality too is that we kind of have to do that work within ourselves. And that's not to say that without doing that work, you can't make an impact. But the reality is if you haven't done that work within yourself, you're going to have a harder time creating change on a larger level. And so starting kind of within ourselves allows us to be much more effective in making meaningful changes in the world around us.
I think we've covered a lot. We can come back to this maybe a little later on.
Could we ask her to come and talk with us?
We could, yeah. We could see who this AI generated woman.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't bring any of these, sadly. I should have, but for our next couple episodes, I think I'm just going to hang them around.
That's right. Just
so
that you can remember. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to kind of put you in a triggered state for the rest of our conversations, if possible.
That's good. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week for some more Kokoro Conversations. We appreciate you being with us, and if you have any thoughts, please put it in the comments below, and we look forward to hearing from you.